Hello and welcome back to Life According to a Middle Schooler. Today's episode is kind of a different topic than I usually talk about, but before we get into what the topic is, I need to address the usual things. First of all, as you can probably guess by the disgusting sound of my voice, I am very much sick right now. But don't worry, it's not COVID. I got tested. We're all good. But also, I haven't posted an episode in like 4 weeks. That's because I've been doing a lot. I've been working on a big, super special, and very long episode to celebrate me graduating from middle school. But I'm currently juggling interviews between 14 different people, so you can guess why it's taking a little bit. And of course, we gotta address all these things. Thank you guys so much for 2,400 listens. It really means a lot to me. We're doing really well on the YouTube channel right now. And by the way, if you are listening on YouTube, you can scroll down and you'll see this little button that says subscribe. Well, according to YouTube statistics, for 98% of you, that button should be red. But if you want to turn it gray, because obviously gray is the superior color, all you have to do is hit that button, and not only will it turn gray, but it'll allow you to see when I post new content, and it'll pop up in your YouTube recommended, and you'll never miss an episode, and it means a ton to me. It helps me out so much. Anyway, also please be sure to send us an email with anything you want to send us an email about, any suggestions or questions or anything. Check out our Instagram, which I promise I'm going to start posting on soon. Check out the website and all of our other podcast connections. And yeah, so let's get into the episode. Wow. Sorry about that super long intro. But, as I said, today's episode is going to be a little bit different. So I have to kind of explain the backstory on why I'm doing this episode for just a minute. So basically, a few weeks ago, I actually entered this essay contest where I had to write a 600-word essay about a doctor. And so I did a ton of research. I watched a documentary about him, and I wrote the essay. And then I didn't really think much about it after I submitted the essay until probably 2 days before starting to write the script for this episode, where I was actually getting my COVID vaccine. And so I was like, oh my gosh, vaccine, what a perfect idea for an episode. So this is actually about a virologist and a vaccine creator, so I'll kind of explain that in a second. So, I already know so much about this guy because I wrote an essay about him. Why not make an episode about it? So, yeah. Today's episode is about the vaccine researcher and virologist Dr. Maurice Hilleman, who is responsible for the creation of more than half of the vaccines that children get to this day. He is an incredibly inspirational and creative person, and yet he lacks recognition in the way that he deserves it. It's said that every year, 8 million children owe their existence to him, and yet very few people know his name. So today, I hope to help to give him a small bit of the massive recognition that he deserves. Oh, and also, at the end, I am going to read the essay that I wrote for the contest in case anybody is interested. I'm not really sure why you'd be interested, but I'm still going to read it just for kicks, The best way to tell a story is to start at the beginning, right? For Dr. Maurice Hilleman, the beginning of his story was August 13th, 1919. Conveniently in the middle of one of the largest influenza pandemics ever, the one that took place in 1918 and 1919. In fact, more people died from the influenza pandemic that year than soldiers died in World War I. And this was conveniently the year he was born. I wonder why he went into stopping viruses, right? So actually, on that topic, during World War II, when a young Dr. Hilleman was actually working for the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, and he was tasked with trying to figure out why the Army's influenza vaccine worked one year, but not the next year, resulting in the loss of many soldiers. So he was really the one that discovered how the influenza virus adapts, mutates, and changes in the human body over time as it grows different spikes on it to confuse our immune system into losing recognition of it. And he's the very reason why the flu vaccine changes every year. And we can't forget that he was super, super young at the time, and this was just the start of his career. And it was really one of his first ever experiences in something this major, and probably built an incredible base for what he was about to come across in his near future. Now, when he learned about the mutation of the virus, he also discovered that pigs could actually be the host for both bird and human influenza, allowing the two to combine and create an entirely different virus inside of the pig's immune system and cells, which had never really been seen before, and this is something that he figured out. Reflecting on this, his daughter actually said that he would have been a really incredible detective if he wasn't a virologist, because he just had this incredible ability to see these things and make these realizations that most people couldn't. And now that he understood all of this information about how the influenza virus was able to mutate and combine with others, he actually became the first person to recognize and prevent a strain of the influenza virus. The first vaccine, people. He actually did this on a very interesting day. One day, he came into his office at Merck Pharmaceutical, and he showed his colleague about how a massive influenza pandemic had hit Hong Kong. This was in all the news right now. It was like basically what we would call viral these days. But rather than just thinking about it as a sickness like most people, he realized that this could cause an entire worldwide pandemic and it could spread from Hong Kong. So he quickly got to work. He obtained samples from sick people and did tons of research, and he quickly found out that this virus had never been seen before. Then, when he learned that kids were very vulnerable, he took a risk. But he wasn't really risking people's health. Rather, he was risking his own reputation and possible career ahead of him to announce to the world that there would most likely be a massive outbreak in Asian influenza cases when the school started in the fall in Japan and Hong Kong. And he knew this because he saw how vulnerable kids were and how commonly it spread through schools. So he made these connections and he made this announcement. And he knew that if he was right, he would save the lives of millions. But if he was wrong, he would lose everything that he had been working towards. His career and reputation would be ruined. But he was not willing to risk those millions of lives. So he risked his career and ensured that multiple pharmaceutical companies produced millions of vaccines for people around the world in a hope to prevent this pandemic. And it turns out that he was right. And the outbreak occurred in the fall of 1957, when school had just started up. However, he had managed to create and distribute enough vaccines that a global crisis was able to be averted, and at that moment, Maurice Hilleman's insane risk of his reputation and career paid off. He was considered the first scientist in all of history to completely avert a pandemic, and yet the chances are you've never heard of him before. Isn't that insane? The fact that you probably know the names of hundreds of actors or celebrities or singers, but you didn't know about a man who has saved hundreds of millions of lives? And don't worry, I'm not trying to blame it on you. I know it's not your fault. I just think that you should stand with me and spread the word so that we can give this incredible man the recognition that he deserves. And after this achievement, Hilleman was awarded the United States Military Distinguished Service Medal. So he was recognized in his time, just not anymore, which I think is very wrong. So now that you learned about the first of one of Hilleman's many, many life accomplishments, and hopefully you're hooked on his story now, I think it's important to talk about his upbringing, and its unlikeliness and unusuality really combined to his life story. And it's strange that his upbringing kind of led to what he did now, but it really does make sense once you learn about it. He was raised in a very small town in Kansas, but his early life was full of poverty and sadness. Hilleman was actually originally a twin, but his twin sister died of a sickness a few hours after their birth. And a few hours after that, his mother would die of an acute sickness as well. When his mother died, Hilleman was sent to live with his aunt and uncles, for it was her last wish. Hilleman definitely felt a form of rejection from this. And he was the only one living in this one house while the rest of his family was in another, causing him to spend most of his life trying to prove to others, especially his father, that he was the opposite of worthless and that his father was wrong to push him away. And this definitely contributed to his hundreds of incredible life accomplishments. He was just trying to not really get revenge, but prove to his father that, he wasn't worth rejecting. He wasn't worth being pushed away. However, living with his uncle turned out to be pretty beneficial towards him. He was able to question many things in his uncle's home, whereas his father, he had to be very by the books and strictly Lutheran and a well-rounded gentleman, right? As a kid, he would always talk about the ridiculousness of Bible stories, which definitely caused a lot of problems with most strictly religious families that he was surrounded by. But he just liked to question these things and think, does this really make sense? He was very logical. In fact, his childhood friend actually told of how he would read Darwin's Origin of the Species in church. And he basically used this and he built his own religion of scientific facts just from that book. He wanted to make a religion out of logic and something that made more sense to him. And a lot of people have said that Darwin definitely had a large impact on his life and what he would choose to do with it. And so, after many years of a tough but personality shaping childhood, Hilleman learned a way out of that life that he would have been pigeonholed into, and he got a scholarship to Montana State College. In 1941, he graduated at the top of his class, and at the time he was particularly interested in microbiology. After this, he decided to go to the University of Chicago, which at the time was the best school for science one could possibly go to. And for his PhD thesis, he actually proved that chlamydia, which was then thought to be caused by a virus, was actually caused by a bacteria, and was able to be treatable with antibiotics. At 25 years old, this man discovered a way to cure what was then a serious crisis virus, leading him into a world of virology. In fact, shortly after graduating with his PhD, he actually managed to teach a class with his previous professor, which was the first ever virology class taught at the University of Chicago. But rather than staying there and teaching, Maurice wanted to go into the industrial world of vaccine creation and virology, and he ended up at E.R. Squibb & Sons, and was quickly put to work creating a vaccine that would prevent Japanese encephalitis virus, which was killing many of our soldiers during World War II at the time. And he was only given 30 days to make the vaccine due to the circumstances. And it's absolutely ridiculous thinking about this. I mean, the fact that modern vaccines take many years to create, the fact that it only took them, a year and a half to create the coronavirus vaccine was stunning to most people. This man did it in 30 days. But, this was a nearly impossible task for most, but most people were no Maurice Hilleman. He managed to find a vaccine. He converted an old barn into a sterile facility, and he used it to dissect and remove the brains of mice, which were then blended in a kitchen blender and used to grow the vaccine. A kitchen blender. They ground mice brains in a kitchen blender. That's disgusting. It was insane. He did this in 30 days. I literally just cannot process this. But of course, this is Maurice Hilleman, so what was I expecting? I just cannot get over the fact that this man doesn't get any recognition after everything he's done. Anyway, the vaccine was then used to prevent our troops from suffering from the Japanese encephalitis virus, and is still used today to prevent the disease from reaching modern children and adults throughout the world. Then, in 1955, just a few years later, the whole world would see what Hilleman saw in vaccines, as a single vaccine inventor took the spotlight from Hilleman and became a literal celebrity doctor. Like a celebrity. This man was no other than Dr. Jonas Salk. I bet most adults have probably heard of Dr. Salk. He's kind of famous, and I bet that the majority of doctors in the world and people in the field of science have probably heard his name hundreds of times. Heck, some kids who have received the polio vaccine may even have heard of his name. But the truth is, maybe he didn't deserve as much of the spotlight as he stole from Dr. Maurice Hilleman. Just Listen to this and tell me what you think. At the University of Michigan in 1955, Dr. Salk announced that he had created the first ever polio vaccine. When this happened, everybody freaked out. Everyone was so happy, and tons of people were basically fangirling and fanboying over Dr. Salk. The news and the media spent months talking about this massive milestone that Dr. Salk had made. And then, just a few years later, Dr. Sabin made a new polio vaccine. But this one could be taken orally, maybe in a spoon or on a cube of sugar. The world was just absolutely amazed by this achievement, and the virology and vaccine creation field was so popular for quite a while afterwards. But why is this so important to Maurice Hilleman's story? The truth is, Dr. Hilleman took this newfound information and realized that this was simply a first step in his lifelong goal to eliminate all diseases that harm the world's children. And because of this first step, he wanted to start working on this goal and achieving it, but he really needed more resources, which is why he ended up working for Merck Pharmaceuticals, which is still a pretty massive company today. And because Merck was very interested in Maurice Hilleman and willing to do what they could to keep him there and get him there, they allowed him to have his own vaccine ward. Instead of working in the main Merck vaccine division, he had his own building, office, budget, employees, and personal schedule. The first thing that he did at Merck was work on the mass production of Jonathan Salk's polio vaccine. But while he was trying to do this, he noticed something. Basically, when Salk and Sabin's polio vaccine came out, funding was given to 6 different pharmaceutical companies to mass produce the vaccine. But the problem was, when the mass produced, it's a lot harder to take the time to ensure proper potency in the vaccine, something that was done very well when Salk was working in his lab with a small number of the vaccines and a large group of employees to help him. Because of this, one drug company, known as Cutter Lab in Berkeley, California, made the vaccine very poorly, with little attention to detail. This resulted in thousands of children on the West Coast coming down with polio just a few weeks after their vaccine was rolled out and distributed, because they had actually failed to deactivate the polio in the vaccine. And as you can guess, this was a bit of a serious problem. And over 200 children got permanent paralysis from this, and 10 of them actually died, just a few weeks after the vaccine was created and mass-produced. And Hilleman saw this as a serious problem, as most would, and he was determined to find a much safer polio vaccine. By doing this, he would show the world that he was the next big vaccine doctor, and it would be his flagship creation. However, during the creation of the vaccine, Hilleman actually learned that the cells used in the vaccine, both that of Salk and Sabin, which were that of a monkey, actually had a monkey virus in them. So, for like 7 years, people were getting a defective and quite dangerous polio vaccine that could possibly give cancer to its patients. And this was not good news, but it was all the more reason for Hilleman to fix this. Hilleman had discovered something that would basically change how people view what was then the world's most incredible creation, the Salk and Sabin polio vaccine. So, in 1960, he explained all of this at a conference of scientists, and he basically confronted Sabin because he was there. And because of this, for the rest of his career, Hilleman had to make sure that he and all of his employees would make safety and insurance of proper quality their highest priority. And now that all of this had happened and he had made his announcement, Hilleman started working on his own polio vaccine. But instead of killing the virus with the vaccine, rather he would try to weaken it so it couldn't harm the host but could still introduce it to the immune system. He figured that this would ensure better and more long-term results. And what Hilleman ended up doing was combining polio with chick cells, then using the chick cells to tame the polio so that it couldn't give people the side effects, but it could still teach their immune system to fight off polio. It was basically genius, and the fact that he figured this out is absolutely stunning. In his own words, what he created was, quote, a very weak clinical reaction and a very strong immune reaction, end quote. And now that the polio crisis was saved by Hilleman, despite him not getting nearly as much recognition as Sabin and Salk did, despite their somewhat failure to make a proper working disease, a new challenger approached. This challenger would be measles. But before we continue the episode, let's just take a quick break and talk about today's episode's sponsor, Anchor. Welcome back to Life According to a Middle Schooler. Before the break, we talked about the new challenger that would be approaching virologist Dr. Maurice Hilleman. This challenger was measles. At the time, measles was killing hundreds of children every year, and something needed to be done. That something was the creation of a vaccine. And Dr. Hilleman was up to the challenge, ready to face the measles crisis head-on. Luckily, he had something to start from. Somebody had already made a vaccine, but it didn't work for half of the children that received it. However, the person who made the vaccine had isolated a strain of measles that would work in a vaccine. And Hilleman knew that all he had to do was make the previous vaccine safer, and this was kind of his specialty at the time. By 1968, he had done it. He found a way to weaken the strain so that it gave no side effects, but still allowed the immune system to learn all about the virus. And it was kind of similar with what he did with the polio vaccine. He made it safer, and he made it so there's no side effects, but the immune system still learns how to fight off the virus. However, he wasn't done yet, because there was still a problem ahead of him. To grow the virus strain that the vaccine used, Hilleman used chicken eggs. However, at the time, there was a massive chicken virus going on, and the virus was giving chickens leukemia, and he didn't want to take that risk to give his vaccine patients leukemia as well. So, being our very own Dr. Maurice Hilleman, he had a solution. He simply had to find a flock of chickens without the chicken leukemia virus. He scoured the earth to find one of these rare flocks, and he found it on a farm called Kimmer Chicks in Fremont, California. Hilleman immediately talked to the head researcher at the farm, but the man was unwilling to sell the chickens because they were the research flock. So, Hilleman, being the persistent man he was, went directly to the owner of the farm, but he still wouldn't sell the chickens either. At this point, the fate of millions and millions of children depended on this flock of chickens, and when all hope seems lost, a miracle happened. While Dr. Hilleman was walking out of the building, he realized that the owner's accent seemed a little bit familiar. He asked the owner where he was from, and the man responded, Helena, Montana. Maurice stuck out his hand and said, Miles City. And the man smiled and told him that he could have all of the chickens, the entire flock, for $1 each. It was truly a miracle, and tens of millions of children were saved simply because they shared hometowns close to each other. Anyway, the vaccine was created, and yet another virus was tamed. At the time, before the vaccine, over 8 million children died every year because of measles. Now, that number's lower than 140,000. Dr. Hilleman really is a hero. Now, the documentary I watched referred to the list of viruses that Hilleman was going to be attempting to tame as his, quote, hit list. And next on the hit list was mumps. The story that I'm about to tell is probably one of the most incredible stories I have ever heard of. I love this story, and I needed to share this. It's absolutely insane. So basically, Hilleman spent months trying to find a strain of mumps that didn't cause meningitis, which was commonly caused by mumps at the time. But he was quite unsuccessful. And one day, he came home and was particularly exhausted after a long day of research, and he was ready to give up and lose hope, when his daughter, Geraldine Hilleman, remember that name for later, walked into his room to inform him that she didn't feel well. All of a sudden, Dr. Hilleman was really excited. Kind of a weird reaction to your daughter being sick, but listen to the story. And anyway, he immediately went to go get a swab, and he tested his daughter. And to his utter surprise, he learned that his daughter's strain of mumps was just the one he was looking for. After all this time, on his perilous quest, it was directly in front of him. And thus, just 4 years later, a mumps vaccine was created by our very own Dr. Maurice Hilleman. And guess what it was called? The Gerald Lynn mumps vaccine. I told you to remember that name. It was named after his own daughter. And shortly after this, Hilleman's second daughter, who was just a baby at the time, was actually able to receive the vaccine created by her older sister and her father combined. It was yet another amazing accomplishment on his incredible resume of them, with yet another inspiring and amazing backstory. Wondering what was next on the hit list? This time it was rubella, a severe virus that had an 85% chance of giving long-term effects to a baby if the mother was infected with rubella at the time where she was in the womb. In 1965, there was an outbreak of this, and Hilleman was ready to stop this. He quickly isolated a promising strain of the virus that could help to stop the outbreak, and he was working on creating another vaccine for his regimen. However, the epidemic was raging, and another one was on its way. So Hilleman needed to find help, which ended up coming to him in a bit of an unlikely way. He was encouraged by a philanthropist that would choose to spend a lot of her money on medical research, Mrs. Lasker. And he was encouraged by her to join his vaccine creation process with that of the federal government, who was already farther along in the creation of the rubella vaccine. He heeded her advice, and the collaboration produced a working vaccine that prevented the coming epidemic. Yet another major virus was stopped by Hilleman. However, the rubella story doesn't stop there. Just 10 years later, Hilleman would replace his own vaccine with that of Dr. Stanley Plotkin. Hilleman admitted publicly and with much ease that Plotkin's was simply better, and he knew that it was smarter to use the better vaccine and protect more children with better chances than to use one that he had made simply to make himself look better. Now, as Hilleman got older and advanced more and more in his career, creating more and more vaccines, more children were getting vaccinated, but the majority of them didn't like the whole sticking a bunch of needles in the arm thing. Because of this, he decided that he should work with some other people to create a combination viral vaccine to lessen the pain brought upon the children, because that's what he was trying to do in the first place, right? Thus, caused the creation of the MMR, which stands for measles, mumps, rubella. And this is the MMR vaccine, and it's still used very often today. And by this point, Hilleman had, according to the documentary, turned the whole field on its head. Now, with 3 viruses treated in one single shot, everything was made so much easier. It was easier on the children, easier on the doctors giving the shot, and most importantly, it was easier to distribute the vaccines to smaller and poorer countries, and made accessibility as well as eagerness to get the shot grow exponentially. Hilleman still wasn't done, though. He wanted to stop any disease that could possibly cause a bit of harm to a human child. However, because he was still reaching for his goal that to most was considered absurd, he started getting tired, overworked, and kind of gruff and rude. He would often be mad at people, and he would use profanity and be very rude to a lot of people. Despite this being the way he operated to work better, the management at Merck, by the way, he was still working there all of this time, but the management at Merck started getting a little bit upset with him and his attitude. They tried to stop this by starting a sensitivity training program, and yet he refused because he just needed to operate the way things get done. This isn't really too relevant to the whole story, but I was actually reading about it, and I thought I would just throw it in the episode since it's already like 30 minutes long. But the hit list still goes on. In 1974, Hilleman actually created the first ever anti-cancer vaccine. How was this man not recognized? He did so freaking much. This makes no sense. He stopped cancer. And no, maybe it wasn't for humans, but it was for his lifelong partners in the lab, chickens. He felt that he owed it to them after all those years of using them for experimental purposes and to grow the viruses in their eggs and their chick cells. And this actually ended up dropping the prices of eggs and chicken dramatically. That's right, he even changed the economy, people. Can we get some respect up in here? Let's go. The hit list still doesn't end there. Next, he worked on stopping liver cancer, which actually is caused by a virus, hepatitis B, or Hep B for short. In 2015, around 375 million people in the world had Hep B, and for decades, Hilleman wanted to find a way to stop hepatitis B. The problem was, it was very hard to grow in a lab, so the isolation of a good strain would be very difficult to find. But he still wasn't going to give up. To grow Hep B safely, he actually took human blood, and he made sure that all viruses in the blood were killed. Then he had to take the protein of Hep B and use it to make a vaccine. It was a seriously complicated process that involved many steps and many people along the way. But Hilleman was determined to stop this problem, and the Hep B virus could finally be tamed in the creation of the, quote, plasma-derived hepatitis B vaccine, end quote. The author of a book about Hilleman actually said that the process took from what was, quote, no doubt the most dangerous starting material we ever used, that I would argue created the safest vaccine we ever used, end quote. And when Hilleman couldn't find people that wanted to be test subjects for the vaccine, he decided to do it himself. And he went into his lab cafeteria and got the whole management team to watch him as he made a scene and became the first person to be injected with the vaccine. Oh, and then he instructed them all to do the same. And when he was done, the vaccine ended up working, and Hep B was stopped. And then Dr. Maurice Hilleman officially became the first person on Earth to create a vaccine to cure human cancer. And then yet another challenger approached Hilleman and joined his hit list. AIDS, or Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, was a serious problem that was quickly sweeping the Earth. The big problem with this was that people were starting to get really worried about the use of human blood in a vaccine, which was what was used in the Hep B vaccine, because they were really worried about contamination giving them AIDS virus. And then the use of Hilleman's vaccine, a cancer-stopping vaccine, mind you, started waning down a lot. And Hilleman really couldn't do much to prove that the vaccine was safe because so few people believed him, and AIDS just didn't have enough research at the time. Until finally, in 1984, the cause of AIDS was found, which is HIV. And Hilleman took this information and quickly, almost immediately, showed that HIV was incapable of surviving the inactivation process that his Hep B vaccine used, and the vaccine could finally be considered safe for use again. But did we really ever doubt the man of the hour, Dr. Maurice Hilleman? I sure didn't. Did you? However, he was still up against a problem. A growth in anti-vaccine groups started to appear. People made up fake science and refused to vaccinate their kids and themselves, discrediting his life's work. It's just ridiculous, and it still exists insanely commonly today. Look, I'm not trying to get political here. All I'm saying is look at what this man has done. Are you seriously going to try and make all of Hilleman's life work basically considered pointless? It's just saddening to see that all of this is happening today, and Hilleman just couldn't really battle his enemy anymore. And this was super tough on him. And as things got worse, he started feeling a lot more sad, hopeless, and depressed. But luckily, he and some other scientists had a solution. Another one. They created an alternative in a new form of genetic engineering. They created a way to harness the power of living cells to literally insert a gene that would instruct the cell to make a protein that would make the new vaccine easy to make, purify, and mass produce. Finally, Hilleman made the push back to the anti-vaccination groups, and with this, when the vaccine was accepted, and it's now said that this vaccine prevented the most deaths of anything that we have developed ever. It's just saddening to see that there's still people who are refusing to get this vaccine when it could literally save their lives, and it's saved so many. Finally, Hilleman could relax. All of this was a culmination of a lifetime of incredible work creating vaccines, and he was ready to slow down in his career. At 65, he retired from work due to the age limit that the company had set in place. He wanted to keep going, keep saving lives, and keep working to stop all viruses from harming the Earth's children. For the next 20 years, he watched ups and downs happen. Ups as vaccines saved millions and millions of lives, and downs as the industry started moving away from vaccines. Finally, in 2005, Dr. Maurice Hilleman died of cancer after an incredible life and career. He created over 40 vaccines in his life, many of which were firsts. He created the first vaccine to stop cancer. He created the first vaccine to stop human cancer. He predicted and prevented many epidemics. He created the first combined vaccines and really launched the world of vaccines in general. His life was incredible, and the things he did with it are amazing. I hope you learned something good today, and I hope you spread the word about Maurice Hilleman. You know what? I challenge you to send this to a single friend who you think could benefit from this information. Maurice Hilleman made many accomplishments in his life, but he lacked recognition, and that's why I'm just simply trying to spread the word, share information, and prove to the world that this man is more than just a doctor. He is a hero. Now, before we wrap up the episode, I do want to read the essay that I wrote for the contest for anyone who is interested. So, here we go. The essay prompt was to explain why Dr. Hilleman is a good example of why we need creativity in science in 600 words or less. So, here we go. Here's what I wrote and submitted. Dr. Hilleman's story and life accomplishments are an epitomic example of how vital it is to introduce creativity into modern science. His innovative use of abstract thinking outside of the box shows that he was not afraid to take risks and go outside of the laboratory, which brought much success that ended up saving millions of lives. One strong example of this is that the incredible relationship he had with something that most people probably wouldn't think of when they think of vaccine research: chickens. On many occasions, he left the laboratory to travel to a local farm where he would use chickens to test or even use parts of them to grow a vaccine or to grow a virus. The fact that his knowledge of chicken farming from being raised on a farm ended up saving millions of lives by using them to make a vaccine that would eventually save millions and millions of lives during a massive influenza pandemic in the United States is truly incredible. It clearly shows that he was willing to go outside of the box, outside of the laboratory, and use something that few people used before his time, which shows his intricate use of creativity and critical thinking. Another very vital example of how his accomplishments convey how vital it is to introduce creativity is his willingness to take risks and put his career on the line to back up something that he believed in. In 1957, Hilleman was researching Asian influenza, and he realized that there was a recent outbreak in schools. Then, he predicted that when schools started up again, many children in Asia would come down with the illness. He then explained this to multiple vaccine distributors and health organizations and instructed them to make and ship hundreds of thousands of vaccines to Asian countries. He knew that if he was wrong, these companies would be losing a lot of money and wasting a lot of materials, and he knew that he would be fired immediately and his reputation would immediately disappear if he was wrong. And yet, he still made the prediction, putting his entire career and reputation on the line. And just like he predicted, as soon as schools started up back again in Asia, an outbreak of the Asian influenza virus occurred. But it was able to be quickly avoided and averted because of the immense number of vaccines produced. We can use this information as an incredible, unique example that proves how vital Dr. Hilleman's use of creativity in science was. The final example of Dr. Hilleman's use of creativity in vaccine creation and just science in general comes from later in his career, when he was trying to create a vaccine for mumps. He was struggling for quite a while, and he just couldn't seem to find a strain of mumps that would work for a vaccine. He tested thousands of children in hopes of finding a strain of the illness that would hopefully work in a vaccine. but he still couldn't seem to find it. One night, he came home, exhausted, sick of all the work and all the failure to find the correct strain. His daughter walked up to him, claiming that she felt sick. And he, being a proper scientist that was determined to create this vaccine, immediately grabbed a swab and found that his own daughter's mump strain was the one that would create the vaccine. As we can see from these many examples of his life accomplishments, Dr. Maurice Hilleman was a very creative doctor, and his work proves how vital it is to introduce creativity into modern science. Alrighty, so that was the essay I wrote. And I really just want to thank you guys so much for listening to this episode of Life According to a Middle Schooler. I really did enjoy making this episode, and I hope you enjoyed listening. Thanks to everyone for getting us to 2,400 listens, and I'll see you in a week or so for my end of middle school episode, which will also be a pretty long one, just like this one. This one actually turned out to be, 40-something minutes. Anyway, I'm Clark, and that was episode 21 of Life According to a Middle Schooler, where I talked about the incredible life and accomplishments of virologist and vaccine maker Dr. Maurice Hilleman.